Today we're going to have Mr. Lamberto Zannier, who is the High Commissioner of National Minorities for the Organisation for Security and Cooperation in Europe. He's also worked as the Special Envoy to Kosovo, 2008, and various other positions. He's a well-regarded Italian diplomat, and our events are as intelligent as our audience, so at the end we're going to have a Q&A after roughly half hour to 40 minutes, depending on what Zannier chooses to talk about, and you can ask your questions then. If you could donate £2, that's a recommended student donation. It helps fund it all because we are a student-run society like everyone else, and it's not always free to kind of do stuff. And you've come to listen to Mr. Zannier, not me, so I'll leave it.
And the £2 don't come to me, so don't worry.
Yeah.
So, good evening. Let me sit here, so just to be a bit more comfortable. Good evening, everybody. Let me say a couple of words more just to explain who I am, what I do, who I work for now, and you know what's in the background of this chat tonight. So I'm an Italian diplomat. I joined the Italian Foreign Ministry quite a long time ago, in '78. And I did like half of my career as a normal diplomat, jumping from embassy to embassy. Then I got a bit bored, started looking around. I discovered I was, at the end of the 80s, I was dealing with security issues in the foreign ministry and disarmament issues. I discovered there was a position in NATO being advertised. I decided to apply, and in the ministry they gave me green light for that. So I applied. This was a competitive position, so I went through tests, etc. I got it. And so for 6 years I served as the head of arms control, and then we developed the agenda. We became arms control, cooperative security and peacekeeping in NATO. And then I went back to Vienna chairing an arms control negotiation for a couple of years. I went back in the system to The Hague for a couple of years, but then I was brought back into the OSCE. There was another position was opening up. It was called the director of the Conflict Prevention Center. Interesting job, I'll tell you about it a little bit later. And so I did that for 4 years. Then I went back to the foreign ministry, and I was in the ministry the coordinator for foreign and defense policy of the European Union, so dealing with EU matters. But then I was put forward by the ministry itself. They asked my permission, of course, as Italian candidate for the position of head of the UN peacekeeping operation in Kosovo. It was a big thing. I had to have an interview with the Secretary General of the UN. I got the job, and I became Under-Secretary of the United Nations for that job. So I spent 3 years, just a bit more than 3 years in Kosovo. And if anybody is interested, I can tell you a little bit the story of that time. Then from there, I saw the position of Secretary General of the OSCE became open for competition too, so I applied for that. I went through. That was a really difficult recruitment. It went on for 5-6 months. In the end, I got that job, so I stayed for 2 terms, 3 years each, for 6 years in Vienna. Then I went back to the foreign ministry, but as I was going back to Rome, the chairmanship of the OSCE, which was the Austrians, contacted me saying, would you be interested in this job of High Commissioner of Minorities? We are struggling to find a candidate that is consensual. In the OSCE, everything is decided by consensus. And you, as the former Secretary General, stand a good chance of being accepted by everybody. So, well, let's give it a try. And I gave it a try. It worked. And so I got the job I'm having now. So in the end, I served, how can I say, less than half of my time in the foreign ministry. And the more interesting part of my career was with these various institutions in a very interesting time, because it was the whole post-Cold War phase. And I could start from that, actually, because in NATO, when I joined NATO, this was July '91. And I went to Brussels. The Warsaw Pact has just been dissolved in that time, and there was an issue on the new security order. What happens now? There's a vacuum in Europe, and there was this in NATO. People were saying, well, now basically the Cold War is over. We won, and that's it. And the Secretary General Werner, at the time a German, was saying we need to start some dialogue with the former enemies. so the countries of the Warsaw Pact. And there was a debate, and they decided to set up a new mechanism. In NATO there's the North Atlantic Council, and they set up the North Atlantic Cooperation Council, and they had the inaugural meeting on the 19th of December of 1991. I still remember the date because it turned out to be quite a historical event. So I was in that room, and around the table, actually this was the meeting, the most secret meeting room in NATO. You needed 3 different security passes to get there, and suddenly, you were there discussing, issues related to the Soviet Union, the Warsaw Pact, and suddenly they were all in that room, and there were ministers coming from Hungary, Poland, etc. Of course, the East Germans have disappeared because we had until and I remember in the CSC, I served for a period in the Italian mission to the CSC in the 80s. I still remember the East German delegation, and the dialogue between East and Western Germans was quite complicated, difficult. So, but all others were around the table, and the Soviets had not sent a minister. They were the only ones who didn't send a minister. There was the ambassador who then became a deputy foreign minister. Afanasievsky was his name. Sitting at the table, and we start the meeting to start discussing the new relationship of NATO with the East. And at some point, this Soviet ambassador, someone comes in, calls him, he leaves the room, and comes back 10 minutes later, asks for the floor immediately, and says, Mr. Secretary General, I have to tell you, in NATO, the Secretary General chairs the meetings. I have to tell you, I've just been on the phone with President Yeltsin, and he asked me to make the following announcement. On the 31st of December of this year, the Soviet Union will cease to exist. And therefore, I'm requesting that all the decisions and discussions that take place, the Soviet delegation will reserve its position, because it will be up to the countries that will succeed the Soviet Union then to decide their own policy vis-à-vis NATO. So this was leaving in direct, in a way, the end of the Cold War and the end of the Soviet Union from NATO's headquarters. I'm mentioning all this because this was a really turning point that affected all the developments after that. In NATO, I saw very closely the debate on the relationship between NATO and the new countries emerging from the post-Cold War order in Eastern Europe. And I remember there were some in the beginning were saying, we need, first of all, to have a deal with Russia. And once we have stabilized the relationship with Russia, we can now rethink the role of the alliance and expand, etc. And others were saying, no, we need to occupy the space that Russia has left in a way free, and which they have no more influence, and then progressively. And this latter approach prevailed, and so that was the expansion of NATO and the expansion of the Euro-Atlantic institutions. What this provoked, however, in the long term, is a relationship with Russia that is really complicated. Russia sees the expansion of these Western institutions as kind of threatening, as aimed at undermining the role of Russia itself. And this is one of the trends that we see recurrent in the work that we do working on security in the security sphere. Now I'll jump to the OSCE. First of all, to tell you, I mentioned serving in the CSC. The CSC is a process created in 1975, the Helsinki Final Act. Some of you may have heard about that. And it was a conference, and the conference that was serving as a conduit for dialogue between enemies, between NATO and the Warsaw Pact. And so I was in the Italian delegation. I was heading the OSCE had an interesting. It was a security process, a security conference, security dialogue, and but it had a very broad agenda. There were in the CSC there was the so-called baskets. One was the political military basket, where we had military people sitting there and with advisors as diplomats, but dealing discussing security relationships, arms control, confidence security building measures, inspections, verification, visits, and we're talking enemies. So we were trying to find a way to learn about each other a bit better and to start talking about reducing the levels of armaments in Europe and increasing the confidence and therefore the stability. So this was only one of the three baskets. The second was cooperation in the economic sphere, and the third was the human rights agenda. Basically, the idea was that if a society is just and human rights prevail, fundamental freedoms are granted, that society will be more stable, the country will be more stable, and the stability of the country contributes to the stability of the region. So it was considered to be so looking at the human rights from a security perspective is in the DNA was in the DNA of the CSE and became part of the DNA of the OSCE. The OSCE comes and originates from the transformations of what I was saying earlier, the beginning of the 90s. So it's a new world. We left the Cold War behind. We need to adjust to the challenges of this new world. So this CSE, this process, what do we do with it? There were some who were saying, well, the CSE has been a major player in bringing about this result of concluding the Cold War, and the reunification of Germany was considered, human rights played an important role in the transformation of the 80s, and arms control was another area. And those were issues where the CSE was very present. So how can we use this process? Should we keep it? And of course, this happened at a time when the European Union was starting to gain, or the European integration process was starting to gain speed. And therefore, the OSCE always had to come to terms in a way with that process. NATO was expanding, covering a space that used to be the space covered by the CSE. So the decision was, in fact, to institutionalize the organization, to keep it as a space complementary to the others. Today, the OSCE could be seen as an organization that, unlike NATO or the European Union, where you see basically at the center of the organization a shared vision, a shared, tendentially shared, and we see that both NATO and the European Union have their own problems. But the idea is that a group of people who have the same agenda, an integration agenda or a security and defense concept and vision that brings them all, keeps them all on the same side. The OSCE is the opposite. The OSCE is defined geographically. Now we have the successor states of the Soviet Union. Of course, the OSCE is also regionally is comprehensive, is inclusive. So everybody in the Euro-Atlantic and Eurasian space, because we inherited the countries of the former Soviet Union, so also Central Asia, the various Stans, etc., even Mongolia joined later. So it goes from Vancouver to Vladivostok. It's a very broad space. Everybody is part of it, so the Balkans and the former Soviet space. The notion is that there are different perspectives, and countries have different priorities. Countries have different perceptions, security perceptions, and we need a space within which we can discuss those differences and try to bridge them, because there is a security problem in this space. Still the disarmament and still the divergences and the different visions. So the CSE has transformed into an organization which has become a regional organization in a way similar to the African Union or the Organization of American States. So a regional organization, a bit broader than regional because it's regional in a geopolitical sense. So it has a transatlantic link like NATO and this Eurasian angle that comes from the Soviet Union. It's inclusive and it's dominated by this consensus rule. So you can't do anything unless everybody agrees. So now we have reached a stage where relationship within the space have become really controversial, so it is really difficult to engage. But then to have that kind of tool is useful, and I will give you an example. When the crisis, what we call in OSCE jargon, the crisis in and around Ukraine started, and Crimea, Ukraine is very central. It was very central on my agenda when I was Secretary General. It's very central now as a High Commissioner. and it's right in the middle of this fault line between Russia and the West, and there is a fault line even inside the country, as there is in a number of countries that are a bit in the space between Russia and the West. I don't know if there is anybody here coming from Baltic states, for instance. You will be familiar with this kind of things, or Ukraine itself, or Moldova. So the OSCE is useful in that sense. When the conflict in Donbass started, I remember there was a debate on can the international community do something, and the Europeans came forward immediately saying we'll take care of it. And in the OSCE they told me don't take initiatives because we are talking to the Ukrainians, we are assisting Ukraine, etc. And they came to us a few weeks later saying, well, give it a try yourselves because we can't engage. Because, of course, the separatists of Donbass didn't want to have European Union there. They were seeing the European Union as a Western setup and hostile, and they were not welcome there. We sent, as OSCE, we have a mechanism of monitoring what we call unusual military activities. So you have military activities in some area that arise suspicion, you can send, and there is one of the mechanisms in this political military dimension, allows you to send military inspectors there. So when Donbass started, the Ukrainians, together with a number of NATO friends, sent military observers in Donbass to see what was going on. And they got caught in a place called Slavyansk by the separatists. It was a bus load of military people, mainly from Western countries, actually, all from Western countries. And they were kept for a week there, hostage. And it took us quite some time to free them. And I remember discussions with this mayor of Slavyansk at the time, was quite a hothead himself, saying, they're spies. They come here to look at what we are doing. And we were saying, you know, there are mechanisms. No, we don't care about these mechanisms. We don't like these people here. And so the OSCE has a chairmanship, a rotating chairmanship. That year it was Switzerland, it was 2014. And the Swiss asked me to explore with the Russians whether they would be ready to accept or to agree on setting up a mission of the OSCE that could monitor the situation there. And I remember I had one day, I started traveling around, I had breakfast in Moscow, lunch in Berlin, and dinner in London. I was traveling like crazy through Europe to try to align the ducks in a way and to make sure that everybody felt that there was a space and a possible role for the OSCE, and we succeeded. One of the things in Moscow I remember discussing was if we set up an operation in Ukraine on the ground, we will include some Russian monitors as well, because the OSCE is everybody, and Russia is part of the OSCE, so Russia will be part of this operation. And they even asked me, how many will you let us have? So I told them, how is your contribution to the budget of the OSCE? 7.5%? Okay, you'll get 7.5% of the operation will be Russians. But they won't operate as a Russian contingent. It's a multinational operation. They will operate as in every multinational operation. So we set up this monitoring operation, mainly in Donbass, but covering the mandate was covering all Ukraine. And they're still there now. Now it's 1,000 people. And it's groups of monitors that are multinational. So the Russian sits in a car with an American, with a Brit, with an Italian or a Spaniard. They go around visiting the areas close to the front lines, and they report every day, and they have to agree among themselves on what they've seen and how to interpret what they've seen and reporting back. So we are forcing, at a time when there are very different narratives on this conflict, we are forcing them to find a common way of describe and to portray what they are seeing. So this is what I'm giving this to give you a sense of what the OSCE is. It's this inclusive space where everybody has to interact and to come to work jointly to portray or to take initiatives on challenges that are common. It's a useful organization because we need more multilateralism in this phase. The challenges that we face are challenges that less and less can be left to individual countries because of the geopolitical divisions. We need, as much as possible, to create coalitions, even if the agendas are different. And the OSCE is a good tool for that. My mandate, and I come to my office, then we can broaden up the discussion again if you're interested. My mandate is a conflict prevention mandate. There was a debate on when the office was established in the early 90s, again, the phase immediately after the end of the Cold War, as even on the name, should it be a High Commissioner for National Minorities, so protecting the national minority protection mechanism, or should it be monitoring relations relations within the society, and the latter prevailed. So my mandate is a conflict prevention mandate, monitoring relations within the society, monitor relations between minorities and majorities. Why this? If you go back to the early 90s, you see the disappearance of the large entities, the former Yugoslavia, the Soviet Union, created lots of conflicts in the Balkans. It's obvious, but also in the Soviet space, with places like Transnistria, South Ossetia, Abkhazia, Nagorno-Karabakh, little conflicts here and there. In the former Yugoslavia, it's even more obvious. The problem was that new borders emerged. The re-emergence of these borders woke up old nationalisms, tensions within the society, rivalries within the countries. They were kept in a way under control in the previous regimes, but also brought up an issue of borders, because what existed before was just administrative lines internal to states, so people could move across them without even noticing. But suddenly, these administrative lines became an international border. You needed a passport. Your property ended up on the other side, so you had the property in another country. So these borders became quite a problem in themselves. And they created majority. They divided populations, and the borders didn't take into account the ethnicities in a way, but divided people. And so this created instability, and this created conflict. And actually, if you think well and jump to today, you will see how relevant this is for conflict today, because if I ask you to give me an example of a classic interstate conflict where one country declares war on another, you don't find one. Conflicts all come from inside the countries, inside the societies. Obviously, then the big players position themselves behind one group or another and make, through that, the political differences even more stark in a way, and they amplify them, and then they run their own agenda through these conflicts. But so where the conflicts begin is within the societies. So if you first of all try to recognize what are the weaknesses of the societies, what are the issues that you need to address to make a society stronger and more resilient to conflict, then you have a chance of being more effective in operating to prevent that conflict. Actually, the UN have now realized that. I met with Guterres and I told him exactly this. And he encouraged me to bring this up in New York, because the UN have been focusing on preventing conflict, but on preventing interstate conflict. And that, in fact, it's an empty mechanism that doesn't, it exists on paper, but doesn't really operate because you don't really need that. So it's not the measures of confidence among countries that you need, but measures that allow you to intervene, to recognize the problems within the societies. And societies are divided in many ways. Of course, the ethnic divisions are the most obvious, but then religious, political divisions, and very often also is that. Linguistic, cultural, all sorts of things that can tear societies apart. History is something I'm exploring now. How history can be divisive, it's amazing. You see now the impact of geopolitics in Europe. I will give you an example. I was not long ago in Latvia, in Riga, and there is a monument, a victory monument, huge thing, just outside the center of Riga. As I was there was a debate in the Sejm, the parliament, because there were some groups that were a bit more nationalistic than others. They wanted to tear down this monument. They say it's a victory monument, but it's the Soviet victory, it's the beginning of the Soviet occupation of Latvia. Why are we keeping this memory of a very dark page of our history? I went to see that monument myself, and it was a normal weekday, it was not a special occasion. And as I got there, I saw flowers, and lots of flowers there. Because in Latvia, 25% of the population are Russian speakers. And they are the descendants of military, there are quite a few military officers who moved to Latvia and then retired there and had families there. Some communities, Russian communities that set root there and live there. And so for them, the memory of the war is the memory of the engagement and the engagement of their fathers in freeing the country from the Nazi occupation. While the Latvians were manning battalions of the German armed forces against the Soviets. So it's a country that has a very controversial history in itself. And you see in these symbols also the problems that the society has in finding its own place in history. In fact, you have multiple perspectives in the society and multiple and different visions of history. And if you run one, you will create a deep division within the society. So you need to find ways to bring multi-perspectivity also in history and also in the expressions of history like monuments. So this is something I'm exploring more and more because it becomes quite a controversial issue and an issue. When I was in Kosovo, and for about 6 months, I led a dialogue between Pristina and Belgrade. Of course, they wouldn't talk to each other, so I was traveling to Belgrade, talking to the Serbs, back to Pristina, talking to the Kosovars and to the friends of the Kosovars, because that was particularly important. And of course, I was talking to the friends of the Serbs too on the other side. And but every time I used to meet with the Serbian president, Tadic at the time, and the Kosovo president I should say president quote unquote, because it's not, Kosovo is not recognized as a country in the OSCE. Every time I met with them, the discussion started with history. And they were telling me, you don't know, but in 82, when we had the Battle of Kosovo, we fought against the Ottomans and the Serbs, and the Kosovars say, but we were here much before the Serbs, and this place was called Dardania, and they have their own version of the thing. And the Serbs were saying that is the place where, the Orthodox Church really was born, and some of our key religious monuments are in Kosovo. So for us, it's sacred land. And the way they see history on the two sides is totally incompatible. So you really need also there to make this effort to bring them together, how history is complicating these things. So these are just examples of the kind of difficulties you find. So how do we address these differences between and within the society, and how can we try to stabilize the society? The recipe that we found, that my predecessor started working on, the first High Commissioner was the former Dutch Foreign Minister. Maybe I should tell you a little bit more about the OSCE and the structures. The OSCE is based in Vienna. The Secretariat, as I was Secretary General, was based in Vienna. It works a little bit like the UN. There are delegations of the countries. There are 57 countries. They call themselves participating states, never agreed to rename themselves as members because some are resisting to the degree, they are resisting a degree of transformation of the organization into an international organization. It's sort of half international organization, half what it was before, a conference. So it's an organization, but without member states, with participating states. So there is a Secretary General, is based in Vienna, and then there are some institutions. There is an Office on Human Rights and Democratic Institutions in Warsaw. In Vienna, there's a representative of freedom of the media, which is a special area where the US invests a lot. And in The Hague, there is this Office of High Commissioner National Minorities, and it's in The Hague because the first High Commissioner was the Foreign Minister of the Netherlands at the time, Max van der Stoel, who got a really nice building for his office, and so we kept it. And so I'm in The Hague, and I'm in this nice building. If you ever come to The Hague, feel free to come and see us. And being in The Hague gives me also a degree of independence. When I was in Vienna, I had everyday visits of delegations arguing and discussing things. In The Hague, I'm left a bit more in peace, and I can better do my job. So starting with Max van der Stoel, the various, and I'm the I'm the 5th High Commissioner. the various High Commissioners started looking at best practices in various areas of integration policies. So where does integration start? And then they developed recommendations and guidelines. And we have a series of manuals that are guidelines for participating states. And these are not agreed documents. If we had to have them agreed, they would be reduced from this to almost zero. So they are basically recommendations, personal recommendations of the High Commissioners, and the strength of these is based on the prestige of the institution, the prestige of the commissioners that issue them. So the first set of recommendations has to do with education. Education is seen as the first step towards integration of the society. Bringing kids from the various strands of the society together, to study together, to learn the state language, because this is the key rule that we say. And this is very relevant in places that where there is a linguistic diversity. I mentioned Latvia earlier, or Ukraine is another example. So making sure that everybody speaks the same language, but at the same time making sure that there is investment in protecting the identity of those who are diverse. You protect the diversity, you nurture diversity as a richness for the society, but you also make sure that through the knowledge of the state language, everybody, every citizen of a country, regardless of its ethnicity, has the same opportunity to fully participate in the society of the country where he lives. One of the problems that we see is that sometimes minorities refuse integration or push back on integration. And they tend to live in a bubble in a way and come close to each other and don't really integrate in the society. And by doing that, they create themselves a problem. And you see it in some of the communities, also in Western Europe, of course, as a result of migration trends of the last year. These are not formally national minorities, but certainly when we talk about integration policies, we look more broadly at the composition of the societies. And this diversity of societies, we think it's a good thing, but it needs to be handled in the right way. And you need to have these integration policies. If you fail, you create these separate islands where, first of all, you don't know exactly what's going on there, and some of them, as we've seen, produced segregation, radicalization, violent extremism, and even terrorism. And that's a result of a failure of an integration policy. That should, of course, include a number of parameters. Integration also requires a respect for the founding values of the society in which people integrate. And this is also an area where education plays a key role. So education as a first step, language, wherever it's used, and this in the way I described it. Participation is the third step. So you check that in parliaments, in the institution, the public administration, the diversity of the society is reflected in these institutions. And these institutions are not the monopoly of the majority of the country, but that same diversity is everywhere. When you see the institutions diverse and reflecting the society, those institutions will be more credible, and they will be more, how can I say, the citizens, no matter their origin or their ethnicity, will interact with the institutions more freely and will feel more at ease in the society. The society will be more stable as a result of that. Then there are a couple of areas on which we focus in particular because they're very sensitive, and these are the rule of law areas: police and justice, access to justice, policing. Diversity in the police is particularly important. The police must be able also to learn and to know how to engage with diversity and to recognize the diversity, and also to recognize and to be aware of attitudes that may not be considered as whatever provocative by the majority, but because of cultural elements, for instance, can be seen as provocative by a given minority. So learning how to address people of different origins is so important. And justice, the credibility of the justice sector depends on the ability of everybody to recognize that there isn't a justice for the majority and a lesser justice for the others, but that everybody is really equal in front of the law. I think these are cardinal principles of justice, and it's important to introduce them in this kind of agenda dealing with diversity and integration of societies. Media, the role of media. And one of the things I've done most recently is issuing a set of recommendations looking at, because we have all the ones on broadcast media, but now I'm looking at social media. And how, social media is a great thing, and we can communicate, everybody can put and contribute to a global debate. But social media can also become an element of coagulation of ideas that might be problematic and create trends or even fake news and complicate processes of integration. And we have seen one of the recommendations we have has to do with possible interference of countries in processes of integration of neighbors or different countries. For instance, back to the Baltic states, there is always a fear that the Russian-speaking part of the population, some of these countries, may be influenced by Moscow. And they can run an agenda that is contrary to the long-term interest of the country and may be divisive of the society, creating stability in these countries, so there is a kind of a diffidence. Social media play an important role, so it's important to keep an eye on that, but also broadcast media and people who watch television. Actually, jumping back to what I was telling you about the conflict in Donbass, because we saw it from the beginning there in Ukraine. One of the things we saw at the beginning of the conflict was that the separatists, when they start getting organized, possibly with some assistance from outside, they took control of police stations and they took all the weapons, and they took control of all the broadcasting stations, the transmitters. And suddenly, in Donbass, people couldn't view anymore Ukrainian television. They could only receive programs from Russia. And the narratives were so different. I remember that time I was watching Russia Today and the CNN to see what news I was getting about that conflict. And it felt like they were talking about two completely different stories, two completely different conflicts. The narratives were so distant. And the interpretation of what was happening was so really starkly different. The Russians were saying there has been a coup in Kiev. Nationalist forces supported by the West have taken over, they ousted the president, they've taken over the regime, it's now a fascist regime that is there, and it's discriminated against the Russians. And of course, guys in Kiev, the first thing they did is that let's ban the use of the Russian language, which was encouraging the narrative, in fact, of Moscow. But then, of course, in the West, they were saying it's the Russians and it's Moscow that is really setting all these Russian speakers in the East and in the South and in Crimea against the regime in Kiev. So, in fact, it is the West that is meddling into... it's Russia that is meddling into internal affairs of Ukraine and stirring up and giving also concrete assistance, etc., to the separatists. So the stories were really, really different, and talking to the two people, it was difficult to find common ground. I myself was very often in Kiev in that period, and I remember intervening also in public debates and saying, don't ban the Russian language. There are so many Ukrainians who have been speaking Russian for generations. You will throw them in the hands of the Russians if you do that. You should really recognize that Ukraine is a very diverse place, and there should be space for people also of different languages. And you will have to invest, certainly over time, in strengthening the role of the Ukrainian language for everybody, but you should avoid these bans overnight, because this will create instability and apprehension in the society and divisions in the society, which, in my view, is what happened. There are many who still deny this in Kiev, but I tend to disagree. So, in a way, focusing on this kind of issues, and history is the next page. I'm working now on seeing whether I can come up with some recommendations that deal with history, including the issue of multi-perspectivity in history, trying to make sure there is in history what they call the mirror of pain and pride. If you if you look at your own history and the highlights of this, and very often you forget about the dark pages, and they're not always covered in history books, but you're proud of the achievements. And that has to do with your identity, and often this has to do with the identity of the majority. But you know, a great victory and a great hero who pulled that victory, etc., can be seen by the other side as a major defeat. The war hero becomes a war criminal, and he killed so many of ours, and so there is a side, another side, and history is also very much related to where you sit in it, and where you are, and from which perspective you look historic events. I was giving the example in a conversation I had earlier. I was 2 weeks ago in Moldova. Moldova is a small country between Romania, Ukraine, that is still working on its own identity. It's a very diverse country. There are the majority, actually difficult to say what is the language spoken by the majority. Russian is still very much in use. It was part of the Soviet Union. And it's still a communication language. If you go walk in the streets, you hear people speaking in Russian. But of course, Moldovan language is also widely used, also politically, because they go back, the Moldovans, to their origins, and part of the history, they were part of Romania. And so they see that connection as in a way very closely connected to their own identity. But then they are having a big discussion internally as to what is the name of the language, whether it's Moldovan or Romanian. And in fact, they can have long discussion among themselves on this. But the history they study is the history of the Romanians. And now, if you are a Russian, or if you are a Ukrainian, or a Hungarian, or then there are other communities of Bulgarians or even of Turks living there, you don't recognize yourself in that history. Actually, you struggle a little bit. So I was meeting with the Minister of Education, who was, by the way, fully in agreement with me, but saying this is so delicate and so difficult politically to raise here. But in fact, our identity is an identity of a very diverse nation. And if we identify ourselves too much with a perceived majority, we confront everybody else with a narrative that is not theirs. And we, in a way, we're not inclusive anymore, and we lose parts of our society. We don't really, integration becomes more complicated up front. So I'm looking into some of these things and coming up possibly with recommendations how to address these issues in contexts where societies are diverse. So we are, as I was saying earlier, we're now promoting this in the UN. It's this now in May, for the 3rd year running, we'll have events in New York, inviting other regional organizations and showing how we do conflict prevention, and of course inviting UN agencies and the UN Secretariat to show how we do conflict prevention using this technique and working with the processes that run within the society in a way to make it more stable and thus to contribute to the prevention of conflicts. Have I spoken long enough? And maybe we open up to the debate. I hope this was of some interest, and then I'm happy to take questions. So if you want to, if you're hungry, we can all go for dinner. Please.
It was really interesting to thank you very much, first of all. You were mentioning Kosovo quite a bit. I was wondering, how hopeful are you for a peaceful, multi-ethnic society in Kosovo? I mean, especially now we've had 2 non-combatants elected for the first time. Are you hopeful? Because they're still obviously very segregated, especially in Serb municipalities. Is it possible, do you think, for full integration?
Actually, I think it's gone worse. I remember last time I was down in Pristina. I met with both Taci and Haradinaj was still the prime minister. Actually, with Haradinaj, 2 years ago, we organized an event on language. And he came to open it. And it was in front of a camera. And he started, so we gave him, we asked him to do the official opening. And he started his presentation in Serbian and on Kosovo television. Then he moved on to Albanian, and then he moved on to English. And this point was that I come from a generation that was, we had our problems, but we were integrated. Everybody understood everybody else. Now, you will say, my kids don't speak Serbian anymore. And Serbian kids don't speak Albanian. So assuming they wanted to communicate, which remains to be seen, but they would have to communicate in English. They don't know, they don't speak each other's language. So we need to go back to rethinking the basics. The society is becoming really segregated, and the young generations are more segregated than ever. So this is not good news for Kosovo. Because the political process is not progressing well, unfortunately. Let's see now the European Union. We've seen the Americans now have invested, and they made a couple of positive steps now with the flights to Belgrade, and we'll have to see what the EU wants to invest. Unfortunately, the latest signals we got from the EU for the region are not so positive. Let's see with Borrell and whether there is a new willingness to restart investing, whether there is talk about the appointment of a special representative for Kosovo. Maybe this might make a difference. But as things are now, I fully take your point on the combatants, but I'm not sure that that's good enough. And sometimes I see the former combatants, they recognized in a way the difficulties they faced, having gone through the whole phase of the UN administration and the frustrations of the expectations following the declaration of the unilateral declaration of independence and the insufficient degree of recognition from the international community. They at some point understood the compromises were inevitable, to the point that even very difficult issues such as the question of the borders were put on the table. I'm not sure how the new leadership will continue that. They might have to go through some of the difficulties themselves before they might reach that degree of understanding that some kind of a deal may be needed to move Kosovo out of this position. They're stuck in the middle of the river, and they're nowhere. They're not on one side, not on the other. So in this moment, I'm not particularly optimistic, but of course I'm looking. And I'm trying to work, now we're working on a project, and it looks like the new leadership, which was approved by the previous leadership, and I hope the new one will continue that support. I'm establishing a Cathedra of Slavistics in the University of Pristina, also to train interpreters. One of the problems we have is that the legislation, there are two official languages in Kosovo, Serbian and Albanian, and now the laws in Albanian are translated into a very bad Serbian, because they don't have good translators and interpreters. And the Serbian communities tell us that there is unclarity about the law because of these horrible translations. So can we start now training people, and starting with the young generation in the university, etc., and bringing back the idea that if the country remains, if Kosovo remains, how can I say, a diverse community with it has it needs policies that involve and bring the two communities in the long term back together, and including the language, including the schools. These are very sensitive issues, but they need to be put on the table. You need to work on that, but it remains complicated and unpopular.
You mentioned some of the ways in which you found Russian engagement with what you were trying to do in Ukraine. What's your feeling about how Russian engagement with the OSCE has changed in the last 5 years, and how you think it might be changing at the moment? Is your feeling that it's very different, or has it stayed more or less the same in the last few years?
Not easy to answer this. The Russians, they keep engaging with the OSCE. They're interested in the OSCE. They find in the OSCE a space that allows them to how can I say, to further their policies and to engage with the West to try to defend their own policies. They have a very strong position, and I had also a personal good relationship with Lavrov. I don't think I got much out of this relationship, but the dialogue was there. It was always possible for me to go out and check with the Russians what was possible, what was not possible, what could be done, like in the case of Ukraine. And in some cases, for instance, there was at some point this debate about Mongolia joining. The Russians were very doubtful, and we had this discussion with them. We found an agreement. They agreed to bring Mongolia in, which was important for Mongolia because they feel squeezed between Russia and China, and they have a policy of the so-called third neighbor, and they're looking for as many third neighbors as they can. And the Russians set up the red lines, not beyond this and that, this level of engagement, but so it is useful to have that kind of space. And of course, also the solution to the conflict in Donbass, Crimea is much more complicated, of course. But at least beginning with the Donbass and the Minsk agreements, we have a process in the OSCE, and even when Russia decides to invest more in that process, and the Ukrainians for that matter, because I've seen also the Ukrainians at some point not investing enough in that. It's really difficult because for Kiev, if there is a sense that there are concessions given to the separatists, this is a killer for the leadership. And the Russians use it. And to me, the conflict in Donbass has always been not so much about Donbass, but about Ukraine. Now, when Ukraine started saying we want to join NATO, etc., the Russians, we felt the squeeze really, and they used this to keep Ukraine under pressure. So at the end, I think there will be a need for a dialogue between Ukraine and Russia, and this will be about the future arrangements, security assurances for Russia, and I think this will continue to remain of importance for Moscow. They kept inviting me to events also when the time when the sanctions were really, strongly felt in the West. Now there's a bit more of a debate what is the long-term strategy of the sanctions. And there is a Moscow Security Conference. I didn't go for a couple of years because I felt what was going on in Ukraine was making for me problematic to attend events related to defense and security in Moscow. But then I decided to go, and I was there, and there was also the Undersecretary for Political Affairs of the UN. There was a certain representation of Western or global organizations. And I remember they put me up in a panel once, pretty high level, with the chief of staff of the Russian Armed Forces, General Gerasimov, and he put up a chart of the Russian vision of NATO's expansion. So the plans for NATO to set up anti-missile bases, but basically he drew a line from the Baltics, which had been reinforced by NATO because of the fear that Russia might, and obviously the disbalance of forces there is obvious that NATO would have reinforced. And so now we have NATO forces in the Baltics, Poland, which has been also reinforced and there is a base, etc., Romania, Turkey, etc. So they was drawing a line saying, Russia is encircled by NATO, we're under pressure, and so we need to modernize nuclear weapons, and this and that. So we are in the logic of escalation, and to have a space where you can try to have that discussion. The problem we have in the OSCE is the fact that we have lost the ability, and that's something I raised with the ministers themselves in one of my recent interventions. In the CSE was a space for dialogue among enemies. So we felt there was a serious security problem in Europe, and we needed a space to talk about the problems we had, even though that dialogue was difficult. And we had the leadership, in a way, to do that. There were leaders in the West and in the East that decided to have that. Now we don't have that anymore. If you come to a meeting of the OSCE, even a high-level meeting, it's all recriminations, accusations, and there are no proposals. There are very little that is coming up. This is, I think, a worrying element from what I'm seeing, the inability or the lack of willingness to have a real dialogue. Now, when it comes to Ukraine, the change of leadership might have opened some space for that dialogue. Zelensky, in his inauguration, gave a speech half in Russian, half in Ukrainian. He's a Russian speaker himself. He understands the problems of the divisions in the Ukrainian society. He understands that he needs to come to terms with the Donbas thing, and he needs to sort this out with Russia. But he also understands that this is a killer politically. So he has to be very cautious on how he proceeds internally. So can he do it or not? Nobody knows. And this is something, but we can continue offering him a space for him to use if he feels he is strong enough and courageous enough in a way to open. And if in Moscow also, I've seen that there has been a change also in the Moscow negotiation team, so maybe there are developments that might open up new spaces for a deal there. So Russia plays a little bit with the tools that they have and the space that they have in the OSCE, and this at times may become useful for them. And it's also an organization that allows them to keep, for instance, when it comes to Nagorno-Karabakh, the Russians have a very strong role in that conflict in the South Caucasus, and through that strong role they also continue to project their influence in the region, both on Azerbaijan and on Armenia, that is also an ally structurally for them. So they have various tools in the OSCE that are of interest to them, and they will continue, in my view, using them.
I'll go to the last question because I think we've got to go soon. As an Italian, obviously Italy's got quite a multi kind of national history, lots of different states. Do you feel as though your kind of own background as being someone who's Italian helps you approach these issues of looking at interstate conflict in a way that perhaps someone that comes from a state that's kind of has a more ancient history than Italy, perhaps being formed in the 19th century? Do you think that gives you a greater understanding of conflicts that face?
From the northeast, so it's the Republic of Venice historically. I don't know whether there is a culture. One thing is sure, I come from a region close to a border. So I'm used to diversity in a way, and to seeing, if I go to Rome, for instance, I find myself in a completely different perspective. But when I'm up in the northeast and close to the borders to Austria and to Slovenia, to the former Yugoslavia, was just 25 kilometers from the place where I come from. And I studied in Trieste, which is a very diverse place, very Middle European, but also Balkanic in some ways. So there is an opening in a way, and an opening also to understanding different cultures and different ways of looking at things. So that could have helped. Whether this is because I'm Italian, I'm not entirely sure. Partly because we are so diverse in Italy ourselves. And so I come from a corner of Italy that perhaps is more open towards the world than other parts of Italy, which, however, may be more open towards the Mediterranean and the Mediterranean dimension. Maybe. But I would say that this applies to lots of us in Europe. And the issue in Italy is really diversity now resulting from the transformations of the last 30 years. The society that is becoming more diverse as a result of globalization and migration and the global trends. So I'm sure that there are, how can I say, people coming from other European countries that have the same kind of exposure as well. It's a matter of how you want to use that.
One last question, we have to be quick because we don't have the room that much longer.
All right, so you're in the room, right? And the former Soviet Union diplomat comes in and tells you that the Soviet Union is going to collapse. What's your reaction? Like, what happens in the room? Does everyone cheer, or is there murmuring?
No, it was silence.
Silence.
It was silence. And then people sort of commenting a bit, and then when I was out, I remember a colleague came to me and said, "Mission accomplished, we can close down." I was saying, it's not so sure. Actually, I could go in more details, but one of the things that happened at that meeting was that after this moment of silence and this Genscher, the German foreign minister, raised his finger and said, wait a minute. We just signed with the Soviet Union a treaty on conventional armed forces. It's called the CFE Treaty, Treaty on Conventional Armed Forces in Europe. And it was a treaty that was based on the notion of equality of amounts of conventional weapons, tanks, artillery, airplanes, helicopters, ACVs, between NATO and the Warsaw Pact. And then within these amounts, then there were sub-limits for each country. So there was a limit, a cap on the Red Army. So they had to destroy something like 30,000 tanks and 25,000 pieces of armored equipment, and all of this in a verified manner with procedures that had been agreed. So they said, Soviet Union is now disappearing. What happens to your commitments? So there was debate, because the Russians said, the Soviets said, we'll take care of it internally, and others said, no, we want a transparent process. The Hungarians came in, etc. So the Secretary General coordinated a bit of a discussion. Then he said, we will host here on I still remember the dates, I'll tell you why. On the 12th of January, we'll have a meeting of experts of disarmament of all the countries, including all the successor states of the Soviet Union, to discuss this issue. And our head of disarmament will organize it. The head of disarmament was me. So I spent the Christmas holiday calling places like Baku and Chisinau, explaining what's the CFE treaty to presidential advisors, telling them, you need to send us someone to have this discussion. It's about your slice of the Red Army. And they all came, because of course they were interested. And we went on for 6 months discussing this, and we developed parameters and things, and we divided the weapons among all these, and the rest was destroyed. And this is one of the things that are not well known, but over the next 6 or 7 years, we destroyed 80,000 pieces of heavy military equipment in Europe. So the Cold War big arsenals disappeared there. And all of this with inspectors. Every country set up inspection agencies. So, and if you think, we were considering each other as enemies until the day before, and then suddenly all these, we started talking about military tourism. But in fact, these guys got to know each other, and that was a huge confidence-building boost, because they started drinking together and visiting the things and looking at tanks being destroyed, etc. So in the 90s, the atmospherics of the relationship, the security relationship between East and West, were really good. And then we lost it because of these, the expansion, etc., and then the fears, and then things went back. And now we're back into more of a Cold War logic, unfortunately. It was an interesting moment, that.
All right, thank you very much.
Well, thanks to all of you, and good luck for your studies.